Did you know? In Crash Bandicoot 2, the lab assistant enemies are referred to as ASS in the game's data. Although this was clearly an abbreviation of assistant, the humorous side effects of the shortening weren't lost on developers. The file for one lab assistant was even named Assbanger. In its sequel, Crash Bandicoot Warped, developers went one step farther, naming the enemies things like asshole and motherfucker. And these aren't the only lewd tidbits from the game's development. When the developers at Naughty Dog started working on a 3D platformer, they jokingly referred to it as the Sonic's Ass game. This was due to how the camera would always follow the main character's backside. The team worked around this problem in several ways, by having the character start out facing the screen, by including the 2D-styled side-scrolling segments, and by adding levels where the character runs toward the screen. The game's villain, Neo Cortex, was inspired by the brain from the cartoon series Pinky and the Brain. For the game's hero, Naughty Dog wanted to take a cute but lesser-known species of animal and turn it into an iconic character like Sega had done with Sonic the Hedgehog. They narrowed their choices down to a wombat, a potoroo, or a bandicoot. The game's working title was Willy the Wombat, although they considered this too dorky. They eventually came up with the name Crash Bandicoot based on the way the character crashed through boxes. A marketing agent from the game's publisher, Universal, wanted to change the name to Wuzzle the Wombat or Ozzy the Otzel. To keep the name they came up with, the entire Naughty Dog team went to the offices of Universal Interactive and threatened to abandon development of the game unless they agreed to call it Crash Bandicoot. Crash's design was largely determined by technical limitations of the PlayStation. He was colored orange because it contrasted with the greens and browns in the environment, which is also why there's no lava-themed levels in the game. He was given a light-colored chest and spot so that players could easily tell which way he was facing, black gloves so his hands would show up against his body when seen from the side, and a large face so his expressions were easily read even at a low resolution. In order to capture a cartoony vibe, the programmers used a technique called vertex animation, which could be used to create animations much more fluid than the rigid skeleton animations used by other games at the time. While this allowed for characters to be easily squashed or stretched, the technique itself seemed impossible to achieve on the original PlayStation until Naughty Dog invented a method of compressing the animations. The game also used so many polygons that designers had to think of ways to hide them so the PlayStation didn't have to render them all at the same time. This eventually led to the game's levels being designed as narrow, enclosed corridors. When Crash Bandicoot was unveiled to the public, its visuals and gameplay were deemed so impressive by industry members that false rumors spread that the demo was faked. Some developers even implied that Sony concealed larger, more powerful computers behind their booths to run the demo. Others believed that Naughty Dog received secret documents from Sony that contained hidden technical information about the PlayStation. While Crash Bandicoot took up all available space on the CD, approximately 2/3 of the game's total size is taken up by a file with random numbers that serve no purpose. By putting this file at the center of the disc, the actual game data was pushed to the outside of the disc. Because the outer area of the disc spins faster than the inner area, load times are reduced. Making the game's file size larger also helped deter people from pirating the game. While working on the game's music, the team's producer suggested foregoing a musical score in favor of what he called the Urban Chaotic Symphony. This would have consisted of sounds like grunts, honks, bird calls, and fart noises being played at random. The idea was rejected, and the game received a traditional soundtrack. During the process of localizing Crash Bandicoot for Japan, Sony requested that several of the songs be changed. According to the game's composer, Josh Mansell, they felt that the boss rounds needed to sound more video game-like. The only reference they gave was music from the Main Street Electrical Parade at Disneyland. My favorite comment was about the original Tana boss round music. It roughly translated into, "The sound of the guitar mixed with the tree imagery is too nostalgic sounding." I'm still scratching my head with that one. This isn't the only odd change that's been made to the series in Japan. When the first game was being demonstrated to Sony Japan, their executives reacted negatively to Crash's design. In response, the presenters from Naughty Dog quickly redrew their artwork of Crash. They gave him black Pac-Man-shaped eyes, made his spiky hair smaller, and closed his mouth to make him look less aggressive. Altering content to suit a Japanese audience was a regular occurrence throughout the series. Crash has a death animation when he gets crushed and flattened into his shoes. Naughty Dog was asked to alter this animation for the Japanese release as it was too reminiscent of an at-large Japanese serial killer known for beheading his victims. The Japanese version of Crash Bandicoot Warped also included several full-motion video clips that were not present in other versions of the game. Several games in the series include a Japan-exclusive change where Aku Aku would provide the player with gameplay hints when they picked up a mask. Throughout the history of Crash Bandicoot, there have been many games that never saw the light of day. In 2004, Magenta Software pitched a title called Crash Bandicoot. This game would have introduced the titular character Crush, an evil twin of Crash, as the main character, while Cortex would serve as the villain. It would have featured an array of vehicles for Crush to use in open-world sci-fi themed environments, but the publisher ultimately passed on the idea. Following the release of Crash Twinsanity, Traveler's Tales put together a series of proposals for a game starring Neo Cortex under the tentative titles of Cortex Chaos and The All-New Cortex Show. The first iteration of the project revolved around the concept of having Cortex command a group of miniature clones to perform tasks such as collecting items or forming a bridge, similar to Nintendo's Pikmin games. The second version of the pitch featured a story where Cortex was kicked out of the Evil Scientists League due to working with Crash and Crash Twinsanity, and Cortex would then have to defeat the League's other members. The game's levels were based around evil scientists from past games in the series, as well as introducing new characters such as a mummy named Entombed, a clown named Entertain, and a scientist with plants for hairs named Entangled. Radical Entertainment began work on a new game called Crash Landed on the heels of Crash Mind Over Mutant. Intended for release on PS3, Xbox 360, Wii, and DS, Crash Landed would have been a retelling of Crash's origin story as he went on an adventure to rescue his fellow bandicoots. It would have also introduced a new mechanic whereby the player could combine items they found to create new weapons and upgrades. Levels would have been semi-linear with optional areas to explore and would have featured a day-night cycle and weather effects. The game spent around 2 years in development and included plans for a cross-promotion with McDonald's and a kart racing spin-off game. However, in 2010, Radical Entertainment suffered a series of layoffs and Crash Landed was cancelled without ever being formally announced.
Did you know? Crash Team Racing originally had nothing to do with Crash Bandicoot whatsoever. The game's developer, Naughty Dog, had a 3-game contract with Universal Interactive for the Crash series, and by the end of the deal, their relationship wasn't as solid as it once was. Universal received more money for each Crash game sold, and Naughty Dog only received a fraction of the profits for all of their work. Management issues, coupled with the fact that they told Universal they wouldn't renew their contract after Crash 3, charged Universal to respond spitefully. Development of Crash 3 literally took place in Universal's hallways, hardly adhering to the contract's required office space. The team at Naughty Dog would often work 20-hour days with no weekends, and Universal refused to pay for the air conditioners after hours, which led to servers shutting down in the LA summer heat. After finishing Crash 3, the team parted ways with Universal and soon begun work on a racing game that started out with generic block-headed characters. The team took their game engine and presented it to Sony, who were keen on making the game a Crash title. The two companies reached an impasse, with Naughty Dog only willing to make a Crash game if Sony obtained the rights from Universal. In the end, Sony managed to secure the rights, with Naughty Dog co-founder Jason Rubin saying that it was a good move that benefited everyone. The team then decided to have a final take that moment with their bosses at Universal. The Naughty Dog team got Rubin a remote control car for his birthday, and one weekend when it was just the team at the studio, they took the car to Universal's conference room and drove it around the table. Needless to say, Universal were furious when they came into work that week, but the team found it pretty funny. The team internally referred to the game as Crash Racing and Crash Kart. Sony's marketing team came up with the Crash Team Racing name, but Naughty Dog would simply refer to it as CTR after the name was chosen. According to Rubin, the entire development process of the game was 8 months and 6 days. He also said it was one of the most fun games he'd ever tested, but one of the toughest to develop. We reached out to former Naughty Dog developer Rob Titus, who gave us some details about the game's production. For 4-person multiplayer, CTR's engine would downgrade the character models to achieve a playable frame rate. The engine used for the game was only used for CTR and let the team create large-looking textures that were actually made out of much smaller ones. The sand on the beaches, for example, are made out of 32 by 32 pixel textures that align to make what looks like 128 or 256 pixel textures. This allows for more detail without eating up the system's 2 megabytes of memory, a problem that plagued the game in several other ways. Much of what the team learned in this engine would later be used for Jak and Daxter, which was in its early stages during CTR's production. There were a number of ideas that didn't make it into the final product due to either system limitations or the tight schedule. Characters like Polar and Purah were intended to play in a single kart together, but ended up being split into 2 races. Both Komodo Komodo brothers were planned in the game as well, but only Komodo Joe showed up in the final game. The starting lines were originally unique for every track, but it was decided to use just one design for all the tracks. Not only did the team not like how they looked, but having varied starting lines was inconsistent and could impact gameplay. Titus, having created the title's tracks, also made a shorter ice track by reusing assets from the other snow levels in the game. The unused track formed a figure 8 and took roughly a day to put together. According to Titus, the level was 98% finished, but there wasn't enough time for the team to debug it and test it properly, so it was shelved. During CTR's early prototype stage, the team also created a replica of Crescent Island from Diddy Kong Racing to see if they could make a stage of that scope on the limited PlayStation hardware. It was only ever meant to be used for testing, but it's believed to still exist on one of the studio's servers. Since Naughty Dog knew CTR would be their last Crash game, they planned to kill the franchise using the main villain, Nitrous Oxide. By making something ridiculous like an alien as the antagonist, they figured people wouldn't take the game seriously and move on from Crash, but to their surprise, the plan backfired. Rubin said, "We actually tried to kill Crash. In CTR, we said, what won't anybody believe? Because this was our last game. Let's put aliens in. We'll bring in an alien. No one will like Crash after that because there's an alien. This'll be the end. We've jumped the shark. The alien came into CTR." Everybody loved it. For years, rumors persisted that Oxide could be unlocked in the game, but he was actually never intended to be a playable character. According to Naughty Dog president Evan Wells, the team briefly considered the idea, but it all came down to technical limitations of the PlayStation. His racetrack, Oxide Station, is much bigger than the other tracks in the game to accommodate his size. Interestingly, the stage itself was cut down to less than a third of its original length to fit in the game. Oxide can be made playable through the use of a cheat device, though he plays extremely buggy and only works on certain stages. After beating Oxide's ghost on every track through time trial mode or by using a cheat code, the player can access the scrapbook feature. The scrapbook chronicles Naughty Dog's time with the Crash series and includes pre-console conversion music for all 4 Crash themes, pre-console being the original high-quality version of the track before being compressed and reworked for the PS1. These tracks wouldn't be heard in their entirety until Crash composer Josh Mansell uploaded them to his SoundCloud years later. The PAL version of CTR shortens the scrapbook by a fair amount. The NTSC version is 5 minutes long, but the PAL version is a mere 2 minutes. This was done to fit all the text, sounds and supported language across Europe on the game's disc. Dutch was one of the languages supported, though this decision was questioned by the Dutch, as English is widely spoken in the Netherlands. In the PAL region, when choosing a language, it's possible to back out of the menu and choose no language at all, which results in text showing up as hyphens and slashes. Even stranger, this also makes the boss characters swap heads with each other, with the exception of Ripperoo. Like with most Crash games at the time, the Japanese version has several changes from its English counterpart. The Japanese version uses a completely different model for the title screen, and the game itself goes by the name Crash Bandicoot Racing. Ripperoo also speaks in actual sentences, unlike the English version, where he was intended to speak normally but instead just used his trademark laugh with subtitles. Interestingly, Ripperoo's voice in Japanese is provided by Katsumi Suzuki, the current voice of Nintendo's Diddy Kong. Other changes include difficulty revisions, different character icons, and like Crash 3, a set of bonus videos. The Japanese scrapbook also has artwork not seen in any other version. Penta Penguin was a character initially known to a select few, as Penta could only be unlocked via cheat codes. Penta was so well hidden in the fact that he was unknown to both Sony and Naughty Dog testers, and his initial code is unfinished. He was planned to be tested in-house like the other races, but apparently slipped by both parties and made it into the final release, bugs and everything. When Penta grabs a mask power-up, Uka Uka's icon is shown, but when activated, Aku Aku surrounds him instead. Penta also has different stats in different territories, having the same stats as Pola and Pura in the NTSC version, whereas in PAL regions and Japan, all his stats are maxed out, which was the original intention. Penta also has placeholder dialogue that found its way into the game. While he typically makes penguin noises, you can occasionally hear Penguin Yay 1 and Penguin Yay 2 play in a monotone voice.
Penguin Yay 1, Penguin Yay 2.
These lines were done by programmer Gavin James, who had done placeholder dialogue for the rest of the cast. The CTR team actually weren't aware of the mistake until they played the retail version and heard it for themselves. Rob Titus told Did You Know Gaming, "When we went gold, I got a copy of the master to play on my PlayStation at home. The first thing I did was unlock all the characters, including the penguin. I started one lap, heard Gavin's voice and said, 'Oh shit.' I called Daniel Airy immediately, but it was too late. The first batch of 500,000 discs were being burned." This error was fixed on the PAL and Japanese releases, but it's still present on the North American re-release on the PlayStation Network store. Crash also had a history with the Pizza Hut chain through the PS1 era, with brand tie-ins starting as early as the first Crash game. Crash was typically paired up with their promotions for stuffed crust pizza, with Crash appearing in Pizza Hut commercials. In 1999, a demo disc was given out to people who dined at Pizza Hut, with one of the demos being CTR. Within the demo is an icon for an unused spring weapon which can be added back into the game via hacking. It seems to have been removed late into the game's production, and according to Rob Titus, it was removed because it didn't really add anything to the game, comparing it to the feather item from Super Mario Kart. There's also placeholder dialogue found on the disc for Coco Bandicoot and a single line of dialogue saying, "Yeah," which was likely a recording of Gavin James yet again.
Let's go! Yeah.
The female Bandicoots themselves all get their names from women who had a hand in the Crash franchise, primarily in Sony marketing and PR. Amy comes from Amy Matsumura Blair, Liz from Liz Ashford, Isabella from Isabel Tomatis, and Megumi from Megumi Hazuya. Megumi Hazuya in particular was responsible for creating the Crash dance for Crash 1's Japanese commercials, which Naughty Dog then put in the games from Crash 2 onwards. CTR was a bestseller in all regions, selling over 4 million copies in total, but it did surprisingly well in the state of Utah. Sony had noticed a spike in sales from the region that holiday season, and it said the sales spike was due to the state's Mormon population. The CTR initials are shared with several religious phrases like "choose the right" and "Christ the Redeemer." It seems as though Mormon parents bought the games for their kids thinking they had some religious significance. In the Insane trilogy, the trophy names for the gold time relics reference various lines from the original CTR commercials, including "Is there a problem, Granny?", "Buckle up, boys, buckle up," and "Booyah, Grandma, booyah." But the celebration of CTR wouldn't stop here. On December 4th, 2018, PlayStation Access presenter Holly Bennett shared an image on Twitter. The picture showed a pair of furry orange dice that resembled a car ornament next to a card that read "Sliding into the Game Awards on 6/12. Many fans put two and two together and took this as a tease for a CTR remake reveal at the Game Awards. And sure enough, a full-on CTR remake titled Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled was announced at the show, slated for June 2019. Did you know? The Japanese release of Spyro the Dragon was somewhat different to the Western game. For some reason, the game runs significantly slower than the American version, to the point that Spyro's charge is about as fast as his regular walking speed in international versions. A director's cut release gave Japanese players the option to restore the game to full speed, but this feature had to be unlocked by 100% completing the game. Another change to the Japanese version is that Spark, Spyro's dragonfly companion and health meter, doesn't change colour when Spyro takes damage, but glows less brightly with each hit. This is because the Japanese version was compatible with the Japan-exclusive Pocket Station, a small device that could link with compatible games to unlock features, similar to the Sega Dreamcast's VMU. Connecting a Pocket Station to a Japanese copy of Spyro makes 30 dragonfly eggs appear throughout the game. Collecting eggs and hatching them will unlock additional dragonflies for the player to equip, some of which actually let Spyro take more hits than with Sparks. This feature was also carried over into the Japanese version of Ripto's Rage. The third game in the series, however, Spyro Year of the Dragon, wouldn't see a release in Japan until the Spyro Reignited trilogy. Spyro was influenced by Insomniac Games wanting a change from the dark themes of their debut game, Disruptor. Universal's Mark Cerny suggested Insomniac create a family-friendly title for the PlayStation, noting a gap in the console's lineup. Inspired by the movie Dragonheart, artist Craig Stitt brought up the idea of a game about dragons. At the same time, programmer Al Hastings was coding a PlayStation engine that could create large, seamless worlds. Having a cute dragon gliding and running across large distances combined all three ideas, and the concept for Spyro the Dragon was underway. Crash Bandicoot artist Charles Zembillas was contacted to design the hero and completed the design in a day and a half. The character was initially a full-grown dragon, but was made younger to appeal to all ages. This dragon was going to be called Pete, but Universal's lawyers believed any similarity to Disney's Pete's Dragon may lead to legal issues. Pete became Pyro, but this was deemed too mature and was ultimately changed to Spyro. Spyro was green at first, but he would blend into the mostly green backgrounds too much, so he was ultimately made purple to stand out from the ground that he walked on. Designer Kirsten Van Schreven is a self-described film nerd and was inspired by various movies while making the game. In particular, the Beastmaker's hub world was inspired by Kurtz's compound in Apocalypse Now, and Clifftown resembles Tatooine from Star Wars. Spyro's levels were designed for open exploration, however, as the PlayStation was incapable of rendering an entire detailed level, developers created two versions of each area, the normal version and a low detail version that used fewer resources. The low detail version was used for faraway terrain and objects, which were replaced by the high detailed version as the player got closer. This technique is common today, but it was very innovative at the time. Spyro's ability to glide created some difficulties for the team, as players could potentially glide across an entire level if they found a high enough place to jump from. So then the designers began deliberately creating levels with high peaks, expecting the player to climb them and spot far off secrets to glide to, and because of this, the gems' sparkles were also made visible from long distances. The team would play other games together such as Mario Kart 64, StarCraft, and in particular Super Mario 64, which became an influence for Spyro. Chief Creative Officer Brian Hastings spent a long time dissecting Mario 64's controls, concluding that it was successful because it was just fun to move Mario around. Insomniac knew that Spyro was a success when they realized they could just have fun moving Spyro around as well. To ensure that Spyro's controls were fluid, Insomniac brought in Matt Whiting, a former rocket scientist from NASA, to program the controls and the camera. Whiting used to work on flight control systems, experience that translated easily to programming for a video game. Originally, the camera was designed to rigidly follow Spyro from behind, but this was loosened up after playtesters experienced motion sickness. Spyro's voice started out very high-pitched, but was then changed to a deeper, streetwise voice. Lines were recorded in this latter voice before it was decided he sounded too mean, and a compromise between the two voices was used instead. Unfortunately though, the final product didn't resonate with fans, and many players felt Spyro was cocky and entitled. For subsequent games, they changed Spyro into a softer, friendlier character and replaced voice actor Carlos Alazraqui with Tom Kenny, best known as the voice of SpongeBob SquarePants. Composer Stuart Copeland, former drummer of the band The Police, worked on a tight deadline for the original game. He'd compose 3 songs a day, then refine them for the next day. Copeland was given early builds of the game and immediately wanted to compose for it. He had difficulty beating levels however, so Insomniac sent him cheat codes to do it. Even with invincibility though, he had trouble doing the platforming sections. While a dynamic soundtrack wasn't possible, Copeland felt the songs would often sync up with the actions on screen coincidentally. He was extremely proud of the soundtrack and considered the songs some of the best tunes he ever wrote. The song Rain appeared on his compilation album The Stuart Copeland Anthology, and the music for Wizard Peak was reused as the credits theme for The Amanda Show, which Copeland also composed for. Copeland would also play the game with his children, and his son went on to work at Insomniac. Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage has 3 worlds themed after summer, autumn, and winter. This led fans to speculate that a 4th spring-themed world had been cut from the game. This theory was strengthened by an article for Slidespin.tv, in which Al Malloy noted that characters would sometimes reference levels not found in the game: Colossus Springs and Colossus Valley. Most of the game's levels are grouped into pairs using similar settings and characters or opposing themes. Malloy provided Spyro hacker LX Shadow with a previously unknown demo for the game, where it was discovered that these paired levels originally had similar names. Malloy emailed Insomniac for more information and received a response from none other than Insomniac CEO Ted Price, who confirmed the team originally used different names for the game's levels. Sister levels originally had similar names but were changed to prevent confusion between areas. In a 2018 stream, Insomniac staff confirmed that, although names were changed, there was never a spring world as far as they could recall. The intro stage, Glimmer, was intended to fill in for the spring season somewhat, but Insomniac had just picked the seasons they thought would look the coolest. The character Zoe has a strange oddity in her dialogue in Spyro 2. Most of her spoken lines sound normal, but some of them in the Colossus and Ripto's arena areas are higher. This is noticeable when comparing the game to the demo version which came with Crash Team Racing, where the same lines of dialogue aren't pitch shifted at all. Whatever the reason behind it, the pitch shifting on Zoe's dialogue appears to have been done late into the game's development, but ultimately cut, resulting in a few out-of-place lines. Another quirk can be found with the Inventor droid at the end of the Metropolis level. The droid has a line where she tells Spyro to come back after killing a few more enemies to receive a power-up. However, the only way to trigger this dialogue is to reach the end of the level without killing a single enemy. This is normally impossible, as several enemies along the way will self-destruct as soon as Spyro gets close to them. Yet another secret is that developer Oliver Wade included his 2 children in the game as Easter eggs. The names Brian and Brenda can be seen as wall textures in Summer Forest and Winter Tundra. Within a week of its initial release, the code for Ripto's Rage was cracked by software pirates and distributed online. To prevent this from happening to the 3rd game, Insomniac implemented an extensive list of anti-piracy measures in Year of the Dragon. If the game detects foul play, Zoe will inform the player that their copy is illegal and warn them about the potential problems of that. Additional side effects include the game randomly booting the player back to the hub world, music not playing properly, the ability to pause being completely disabled, and Sparks not displaying Spyro's health properly. In European versions, the language will also change at random. If the player still somehow manages to reach the final boss on a pirated copy, they will then immediately be sent back to the title screen and the game will erase their save data. Spyro Year of the Dragon was released in 2000, the Year of the Dragon in the Chinese Zodiac. The game was developed in just 10.5 months and had an emphasis on minigames to add variety to the gameplay. Many titles served as inspiration for these minigames, such as Tony Hawk, Doom, GoldenEye, Mario Kart, Crash Bandicoot, Ready to Rumble, Mario 64, Rampage, and many others. The game also featured the active challenge tuning or act system, which dynamically alters the game's difficulty depending on the player's performance. This allowed the game to be accessible to newcomers while also challenging hardcore gamers. Year of the Dragon even shares hidden data with Spyro 1 and 2. Within all three games are quotes from notable writers such as William Shakespeare and Edgar Allan Poe, serving no other purpose than to pad out the game's files. At the end of the list is a line that reads, "I always get the Shemp." This is a reference to an in-joke among the developers of Insomniac, where getting the Shemp referred to being tasked with an unpleasant or difficult job. This joke was also the inspiration for the name of the boss, Dr. Shemp, in the original Spyro. Following the success of Crash Bandicoot N. Sane Trilogy, fans speculated that Activision would remaster Spyro as well, speculations that were confirmed with the announcement of Spyro Reignited Trilogy. One of Charles Zembilla's sketches from 2002 was actually used as reference for Reignited's front cover. Zembillas wasn't aware of the project and only found out about it when the trailer was released. Then, in an interview with Game Brain, he said the remastered version of Spyro was the most accurate representation of his vision for the hero. He also expressed frustration that his contribution towards the series went largely unnoticed and felt regret that Activision didn't contact him at any point, but he acknowledged that that was the nature of the industry. Tom Kenny re-recorded all of his lines for all three games in the trilogy, and Copeland provided a brand new soundtrack for the game. He was also consulted about the remastered dynamic soundtrack many times by musician Steven Vankov. Over the years, the Spyro series has had close association with the Crash Bandicoot series, to the point that games in each series have included demos for the other. Crash Bandicoot Warped includes a demo of the original Spyro, which could be accessed by inputting a code on the main menu. Upon the release of the N. Sane Trilogy, players who input the same code on the Warped menu screen saw that the game recognized the code as the highlighted selection on the menu would disappear, though nothing changed. Following the announcement of the Reignited Trilogy, the N. Sane Trilogy received an update where inputting the code would now play the announcement trailer for the Reignited Trilogy as a nod to the Spyro demo in the original game.
Did you know? Hideo Kojima originally envisioned Metal Gear Solid as a recreation of Metal Gear 2: Solid Snake. Metal Gear 2 was originally released for the MSX2 home computer system. While the system was popular in Asia, they were rare elsewhere. Because of this, Metal Gear 2 wasn't released outside of Japan until 2006, where it was repackaged with Metal Gear Solid 3 Subsistence. Many of the gameplay components in Metal Gear Solid were introduced 8 years earlier in Metal Gear 2. Players were given the task of rescuing a female contact, Holly White, after her cover was blown. A similar situation played out in Metal Gear Solid with Meryl Silverberg. The female contact in both games operates on radio frequency 140.15 and becomes romantically involved with Snake. Gray Fox was not the first ally-turned-enemy ninja in the Metal Gear series either. After defeating the Metal Gear 2 boss Black Ninja, he is revealed to be Kyle Schneider, who helped Snake in the original Metal Gear. Metal Gear 2 also had a chase scene up a spiral staircase, an ambush by 4 hidden attackers in an elevator, and a battle with a Hind D chopper using Stinger missiles. It even had a radio frequency on the game box needed to progress the game, just like in Metal Gear Solid. While Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake provided a baseline for Metal Gear Solid, technological changes made it possible to present Snake in 3D for the first time. This meant he had to be a more physically fleshed out character. Kojima assigned concept artist Yoji Shinkawa to design the character. Kojima said, "I asked Shinkawa to create an older, hard-boiled dandy character, but he said it's better to have a younger character. So Solid Snake became about 20 to 40. I asked him to make the character nimble and muscular, but with the body like a Van Damme. Regarding the face of the character, I wanted it to be something like Christopher Walken. The result came out to be the one you will see in the game. It's not like a Schwarzenegger at all. He has to perform espionage, so I wanted the character to be like a cat, but still have a strong presence." Another major influence on Snake's character came from the 1981 John Carpenter film Escape from New York. Kojima has openly admitted that he drew inspiration from the film's protagonist, Snake Plissken, when creating Solid Snake. During an October 2015 interview with The Hollywood Reporter, Carpenter mentions that Canal Plus, one of the rights holders of the film, wanted to go after Metal Gear Solid for copyright infringement. Carpenter, as one of the other rights holders, explained, "I told them not to do that. I know the director of these games and he's a nice guy, or at least he's nice to me." Before going into video games, Kojima admitted that he wanted to be a director. In a special promotion carried out by Japan's largest video retail chain, Tsutaya, they created a list of 15 magnificent movies that influenced Metal Gear Solid. Among these films are The Guns of Navarone, The Great Escape, Goldfinger, Die Hard, Full Metal Jacket, and Dawn of the Dead. Kojima has said that Planet of the Apes gave him the courage to create a video game with a strong anti-nuclear stance, which became a running theme in all of his games. Predator supplied the idea for the stealth camouflage camouflage suit worn by the cyborg ninja Gray Fox. The true names of Solid Snake and Otacon, David and Hal, originated from Kojima's favorite film of all time, Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. If the player gets the Otacon ending, the two have an exchange that acknowledges the reference. Some fans have speculated that Snake was named for his voice actor David Hayter. This is incorrect and purely coincidental. Unlike most games at the time, Metal Gear Solid used professional actors to portray characters. Unfortunately, because of the blurred lines between games and the Screen Actors Guild rules, many of the voice actors used aliases. The only exception was David Hayter. However, under the credits for the European version of the game, the voice of Snake was listed as Sean Barker. This was the alias Hayter created based on the character he played in the 1994 live-action movie Guyver: Dark Hero. All of the real names were finally published in the game's 2004 GameCube remake, Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. The game also includes a re-recorded script using almost the exact same cast. Hayter actually gave up half his salary so Konami could afford to bring back the original cast for The Twin Snakes. Metal Gear Solid was revolutionary because of its use of 3D in-game cutscenes. Kojima has said that he aimed to create a game that was not only graphically superior, but more importantly, create a realistic experience. In order to do this, he created all of the cutscenes with polygons rendered in real time on the PlayStation's hardware. The only pre-rendered CG used for the game was created for promotional purposes. The word Solid in the title had three meanings. The first meaning was a reference to Snake's name being Solid Snake. Another meaning was to emphasize the switch from 2D to a more solid world of 3D. The third meaning was a jab at the video game company Square. Kojima told the publication Gamers Today, "A square is a two-dimension thing, and I guess the president of Konami wanted this game to surpass Square. They wanted to make it a cube, like solid 3D, so it's got that meaning too." In order to create his solid world, Kojima used Lego bricks to plan out each level. The team would then position cameras over each structure in order to give them a real-time perspective of the layout and proportions, allowing Kojima to direct the entire scene. This process took as long as it sounds and was very taxing on Kojima's family life. During a presentation at the University of Southern California, Kojima explained that his son would see his work and report back to his mother that his dad plays with Legos all day. The game also has quite a few secrets and Easter eggs. While going through the caves, if the player faces Meryl and slaps her, she whistles and the wolves will attack Snake. However, if the player can immediately hide under a cardboard box after the slap, a wolf will venture over, lift its leg, and urinate on the box. Using the pee-soaked box will allow the player to move through this area without being hassled by those wolves. Speaking of Meryl, Metal Gear Solid was not the first time she's shown up in a Kojima game. Her character originated in Kojima's 1994 adventure game, Policenauts. References to Policenauts can be found throughout Metal Gear Solid. In Otacon's office, there's a poster of the Policenauts box art, and during Meryl's ending, she laughs and calls Snake Dave. Even though Snake's name is a reference to Dave from 2001: A Space Odyssey, this interaction possibly references Meryl's interactions with her Policenaut partner, Dave Forrest. Kojima envisioned Meryl's character in the original Metal Gear Solid story as a preteen inspired by Natalie Portman's character in Leon the Professional. Interestingly, Meryl's age wasn't changed because of the inappropriate age difference to Snake, it was because the weapon she used, a Desert Eagle, couldn't be managed by a 12-year-old girl. In Policenauts, Meryl has a tattoo on her left arm which appears to be a blue-colored version of the original Foxhound logo from Metal Gear 2. In Metal Gear Solid, the same tattoo can be seen on her left arm. The connection is more obvious in the GameCube version of the game thanks to its higher graphical fidelity.
Hello and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. In this episode we'll be exploring trivia from a variety of games released for the original PlayStation. This was Sony's first true foray into the world of gaming consoles. Originally, Sony didn't intend to dive headfirst into the industry on their own and hoped that they'd be able to partner with already established game publisher Nintendo. Sony planned on supplying a peripheral to Nintendo's SNES system which would expand its capability with the use of compact disc technology. Despite not receiving any help from the creators of Mario though, Sony managed to build a massive gaming empire with a few mascots of their own. One of these mascots was Crash Bandicoot, who had 5 whole games on the PS1, selling over 23 million units combined. Possibly the most praised Crash game, Crash 3 Warped, has an interesting Easter egg hidden in plain sight. In the Egyptian-themed levels there are hieroglyphs of a black dog on the walls. These markings are speculated to represent Morgan the dog, a pet at Naughty Dog at the time. Morgan was also featured in a behind-the-scenes skit for the making of Crash 3, where the pupper infiltrates the studio. The remake of Crash Bandicoot 1 through 3, the Insane Trilogy, also kept this reference intact. Another massively popular franchise on the original PlayStation was the Final Fantasy series. The most popular of the PlayStation entries, Final Fantasy VII, managed to sell nearly 10 million copies on its own just on the PS1. This was no doubt due to word of mouth and a solid marketing campaign. One of the advertisements for the game reads, "Someone please get the guys who make cartridge games a cigarette and a blindfold." And if it were available on cartridge, it would retail for around $1,200. This was an obvious jab at Nintendo and their cartridge-based system, the Nintendo 64, which was notoriously expensive to publish games for. In fact, part of the reason Square switched to Sony over Nintendo was because of the PS1's use of the much cheaper CD format. Some games for the PS1 were censored when brought to the West. One such game that was changed was Breath of Fire 4, most of its regional differences surrounding risque moments in the Japanese game. This includes a scene altered after the game's main protagonist, Ryu, places his hand on Ursula's chest. Rather than remove the scene, the character's reactions are altered instead. Ursula would be involved in another altered scene during a moment where the player attempts to board a ship. To prove the team's value as crew on the ship, they are asked to spend a night on the ship to show their bravery. They are also told that misbehaving at sea will result in spanking and that they'll have to show their backsides to prove their determination. Ursula then reveals a little more of her bold nature than the sailors had anticipated by dropping her pants. In the international release, the scene simply ends before this all takes place. Another scene that was cut entirely involves Ryu patiently keeping guard while the female party members bathe, though not holding back his temptation to sneak a quick peek, to which he is shot at and called a pervert. Though nothing explicit is shown, the implication was likely considered too adult for a teen-rated title. This isn't the only game to have a change due to it revealing a little more than what Western audiences are used to. During the opening cinematic for the PlayStation release of Soul Blade, I'm really sorry, I don't know how the hell to say this name. Sophitia? How to pronounce is the bet? Oh, they're all minus rated. Oh, Jesus Christ. Sophitia can be seen bathing in a large pool of water before being disturbed by a large statue emerging in front of her. In the international release, Sophitia is wearing a white bathing suit. However, in the game's original Japanese release, she is instead completely naked, covering herself as she stands up. A game with a different kind of revealing content is Silent Hill. Within the data of the game's demo, found on the demo disc number 16, published by the official US PlayStation magazine, are a number of unused placeholder images. These include several pieces of unused artwork, including the game's warning for grotesque imagery and early 3D renders for several of the game's characters. However, a few other curious images can also be found, some with notes from the developers themselves. Examples include a quote from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, or more humorously, this image, which reads, "I'm clueless when it comes to soft image. Just imagine there's an open book here, with a picture of a hunter, and a lizard with its mouth open wide." However, most surprising of all are two unused images for the game's menus. Firstly, the game's save load screen, which had a placeholder image of a fully nude woman lying on a hospital bed. And second, an image of 6 fully nude Japanese women which was used as a placeholder for the game's options menu. Unsurprisingly, these went unused and cannot be found on the disc of the game's retail release. One other title with hidden content which wasn't supposed to be seen by players, particularly with its intended audience in this case, was Rocket Power Team Rocket Rescue. Within the game's data are a number of messages with some unsavoury language, particularly when you take into account that the game is based on a children's cartoon show. These read, "Too many vertices. Me brake tray. Over the f***ing top. What the f*** are we doing here? Trying to load dude stuff." These images were used by the team during development rather than anything that would have been displayed to the user during gameplay. The action game 007 Tomorrow Never Dies also contains hidden content. Initially, the opportunity to develop the title was offered to game studio Rare, who had famously created the Nintendo 64 adaptation of GoldenEye. Although being given the chance to make a game on the next big Bond movie was tempting, the studio declined the offer. Instead, the opportunity was given to Black Ops Entertainment. Interestingly, hidden within the game's data is a photograph of a few members of the development team. Also within the data are several images making reference to a multiplayer mode, a very popular element of GoldenEye, despite not appearing in the final release of Tomorrow Never Dies. Another licensed game released on the original PlayStation was Star Wars Masters of Teräs-Käsi. The game's name, or more specifically Teräs-Käsi, is actually Finnish for steel hand. The term had never been used within the Star Wars films at the time, but instead first appeared in the Star Wars novel Shadow of the Empire, written by Steve Perry, part of the extended universe prior to Disney's acquisition. Perry came up with the name after looking for a certain kind of sound that he had in mind, Norse language having the kind of rhythm that he desired. Terraskasi is a form of hand-to-hand combat which would be adopted into the new canon lore of the films with the release of Solo, a Star Wars story. Sith Lord Darth Maul, the leader of the Crimson Dawn, was an adept practitioner of the combat style, teaching it to Dryden Voss, who in turn trained his lieutenant Kira. An interesting piece of lore that wasn't recognised in its first appearance on the PS1 can be found within Tekken 2. While fighting on Heihachi Mishima's stage, the Pagoda Temple, it's possible to see a carving on the ground. This carving is actually the names of both Heihachi and Kazumi, though it's hard to see this during regular gameplay. Kazumi, Heihachi's wife, was only ever alluded to once more after this in Tekken the Motion Picture, a two-part anime OVA adaptation of the series released in 1998. The film, which is considered to be non-canon, has a brief mention of Kazumi. Kazumi would finally be revealed in the official canon in Tekken 7, released in 2015 to Japanese arcades. This means that her inclusion in the Tekken universe was first alluded to in 1995, 20 years before her official debut. The strategy RPG game Kagero Deception 2 has a character who makes a fairly hidden cameo. Deception 2 has a total of 4 different endings, and if a player has a save file with all 4 endings having been achieved, which is no small task mind you, a secret trap can be unlocked. The trap is actually a Suizo from the Monster Rancher series. When activated, the monster will fall from above and slam into adversaries. Another game with many secrets on the PS1 was Castlevania Symphony of the Night. The game, considered to be one of the best within the series, actually had several early ideas which never came to fruition. One of this was the consideration that, since the game takes place in Dracula's castle and Alucard would have once lived there, he would have his own room. The idea was to have the player be able to find Alucard's room at the top of the tower located to the right of the map. A character would have been found in this room known as the Skeleton Carpenter, and as the game progressed, the room would be built up with new furniture. There were thoughts of also including items and decorations throughout the game that the player could pick up and use to decorate the room to their liking. This feature was actually included in the game early on but was ultimately cut. Another early idea for the game was to feature skeletons that would replace candles which the player breaks. Considered more as a joke, the staff thought that if they included these skeletons, killing them before they had a chance to run away would result in the candles never reappearing after they were destroyed.
We've said it once and we'll say it again. The Sony PlayStation represents a moment in gaming where it felt as though the future was within our grasp. While in retrospect the system had its limitations, bizarre 3D rendering, stunted video playback, a low resolution, and initially releasing with controllers that didn't work well with 3D environments, developers created many new experiences that pushed for greater immersion and storytelling, interesting mechanics that weren't possible before, and environments that oozed atmosphere. And with it being the 90s, you could even play your music CDs to pump out Limp Bizkit at the highest quality. The console was home to titles like the tactical espionage-centric Metal Gear Solid, the moody and gothic tones of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, professional wheelman simulator Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, film tie-in 007 Tomorrow Never Dies, indie productions like Devil Dice, and the only slightly derivative action-adventure game, Alundra. But we'll start off today's episode with a classic that everyone knows, Crash Bandicoot. Back in the game's very earliest days as Project Willy the Wombat, Mark Cerny apparently was commissioning Hanna-Barbera Cartoon Studios to create and develop the character known only at that time as Willy. That was the name that Jason Rubin had chosen for his main character in his 6-page brief. Hanna-Barbera Studios were just around the corner from Universal Studios, making them an ideal partner. The artist who the studio assigned to the project was a young Butch Hartman, creator of The Fairly Odd Parents and Danny Phantom. But all Hartman knew about the character was that they span around and smashed into crates, and he'd read that wombats had beaver-like teeth, so his designs ended up being a hybrid between a beaver and Taz the Tasmanian Devil. If you've ever played or even just seen Crash Bandicoot, you'll know that this particular design was outright rejected. But now for a classic that few remember, probably the best Zelda clone ever made, Alundra. The studio that localized Alundra for the West, Working Designs, stated that during the localization process, they'd lowered the health of the game's enemies from the Japanese version, but increased their attack. This would ostensibly make things move along more quickly, and enemies would be more dangerous and exciting. However, this was a complete lie. Almost every single enemy in the game actually received an HP boost in the Western release, with nearly 30 enemies and bosses having an extra 50% or more health. Another interesting aspect of the game's localization appears with the character of Bonaire, who takes on a very typical surfer dude persona, though in the Japanese version of the game, this wasn't the case. The character's dialogue was altered and used as a representation of one of the game's main localizers, Zach Meston. One of the game's localization staff, Victor Ireland, stated on the GameFAQ's message board, "Bonaire just looked like a surfer dude to me, and his dialogue came out of conversations back and forth with Zach. He was basically a proxy for Zach, who wrote quite a bit in the game as well. As it went along, I encouraged him to turn up the volume on that character and make him a more exaggerated version of his secret self. The Japanese version of him was boring, and the name was different. This explains why the character may seem a bit odd compared to others, particularly the dialogue, 'Dude, it's okay if not everyone here believes in the gods. The faith of a few and a little weed is all we need, bro.' In all honesty though, if you are a fan of the Zelda franchise, you would be doing yourself a favor to check out Alundra if you haven't already done so. Alundra's translation was taken on by a fairly small team, but the team behind one other release has perhaps even more humble origins. Long before the PS1, home systems often had an emphasis on players being able to create their own games for the system. This tradition seemed to die off slowly over time, with most of the major contenders of the home console space being closed off. Sony wanted to change this approach with the PlayStation, and provided customers with the choice to purchase a homebrew development kit, which simply looked like a black PlayStation called the Net Yaroze. Most games created by Net Yaroze developers that saw any kind of release would see their way onto various PS1 demo discs, but one game managed to bag itself a full-blown commercial release. Devil Dice, a title developed by Shift, was lifted out of obscurity and given space as a full commercial game, thanks to Sony taking notice. The title, which is a rather unique puzzle game, managed to go on to become a massive success, selling well over 1 million copies worldwide, with over 850,000 being sold in Japan alone. The Net Yaroze platform actually brought many would-be game developers out of the woodwork, including people like Kenkichi Shimuka, the creator of Ape Escape, or Mitsuru Kamiyama, who would go on to direct the Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles series for Square Enix. Another strong aspect of the PlayStation was its advanced audio capabilities, which worked well for the James Bond franchise, a franchise well known for its musical numbers, with each film featuring a major artist to sing its opening theme. While the games don't always follow this same pattern, 007 Tomorrow Never Dies had a curiosity with a track that appears within the game's data. While never heard in-game, the track is referenced in the game's opening music credit sequence as Tomorrow Never Dies 2, though the track has been officially titled Letter to Paris, as seen on the game's official soundtrack. Code for the track does exist in the game's data, but it seems it must have been cut from the title at some stage, only appearing on the OST as a bonus hidden track. The song, composed by Tommy Tallarico and performed by Elaine Piver, is likely one of the most obscure and rare official musical numbers within the James Bond franchise. And it's actually pretty jamming. Another classic on the PS1 is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, which has some unlikely inspiration. The idea to have players collect videotapes was directly inspired by the collection of stars in Super Mario 64. In designing the objectives, the team would gather at a table, draw a level, and then ask what could be done within said level. upon which the team members would provide ideas. Some rejected concepts from these sessions include levels taking place on a highway and a jetty, and a scenario in which the player would lose a wheel and have to skate on 3 wheels. That said, one level taking place on a highway-like strip was implemented during development, but was ultimately cut. This level was called Downhill, and was almost an exact copy of a level from Sega's arcade title Top Skater, which is probably why it was cut. The level would later be heavily reworked and implemented in the PS1 and Nintendo 64 versions of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 with the same name, this time set in Rio de Janeiro. One of our personal favorite games on the system is a continuation in a series that changed said series forever. Castlevania Symphony of the Night saw the return of Dracula's son, Alucard, and gave the player access to a more substantial set of abilities compared to earlier Castlevania releases. In a 1997 interview with the game's director, Koji Igarashi, and designer Toshiharu Furukawa, they were asked how they came up with ideas for the game's huge assortment of weapons and items. Igarashi stated that they used a variety of different references, books, and other materials, and tried to include things that had never been used in a Castlevania game before. Furukawa added that each of the staff members had a special attachment to a different kind of blade, so they ended up using a good variety of blades in the final game. However, this bias did result in the developers' favorite weapons being overpowered, adding that not realizing that no one liked shields was a bit of a blind spot. During the planning stages of the game, they also came up with an alignment system. If the player used a lot of sub-weapons, they'd gain a holy alignment. If they used a lot of magic, they would gain a dark alignment. There would be different endings based on these alignments, with various subtitles, with Igarashi citing one of them being named Shima no Toriru, something like the trill of light and darkness. A trill is a musical ornament where 2 adjacent notes, holy and evil, alternate rapidly. The reason for this feature's removal is unknown. Speaking of titles that changed a series, according to Final Fantasy VII's art director Yusuke Nayora, he liked how his design of the city of Midgar turned out and had envisioned the city in his head as a pizza while he was designing it. This inspiration was actually referenced within the game itself. After the first Avalanche mission at the start of the game, Barrett will talk to Cloud about the upper plate of Midgar, saying, "The upper world, a city on a plate." It's because of that fucking pizza that people underneath are suffering. Nayora's inspiration is also referenced in the name of the song Underneath the Rotting Pizza, which prominently plays in many of the slum areas in Midgar. There's other interesting references in the game as well. The katakana for the enemy Gigi can also be read as Ziggy, the persona of David Bowie in Ziggy Stardust. The enemy model is based on this pun, looking like Ziggy Stardust and with a guitar for a tail. Both Gigi and the enemy it is fought alongside with, Christopher, use song attacks, and Christopher uses an attack called Stardust March, but only if Gigi is still alive. Next up, how about a little bit about the classic tactical espionage game Metal Gear Solid? According to a 1998 PlayStation Magazine interview with director, producer, writer, and general everything man Hideo Kojima, as well as designer and artist Yoji Shinkawa, Kojima originally had no intentions of adding the cyborg ninja character design for Gray Fox to the game, and that Shinkawa only drew the character because it's cool. At first, Shinkawa thought Gray Fox should have looked like a normal enemy soldier. He had several different ideas in mind and thought to try drawing a cyborg-ish and ninja-looking guy, of which the final design came out as a result. Despite Shinkawa wanting his design to become the main character in his own game, it didn't. Raiden, however, became a cyborg ninja in Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots, and later became the main character of his own game in Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. So, in some small way, Shinkawa got to see his idea realized.
Did you know? Neversoft, the company behind Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, originally developed games for a toy company. After departing a small video game development company owned by Malibu Comics called Malibu Interactive, Joel Jewett, Mick West, and Chris Ward founded Neversoft Entertainment. They first found work with Playmates Toys, developing a Sega Saturn game based on the television show Skeleton Warriors. As development continued, Neversoft grew, and by 1996, the staff consisted of over 20 people. Unfortunately, the days ahead were less than favorable. Neversoft worked for Crystal Dynamics on a game based on Ghost Rider, but it was cancelled due to financial problems. They then began to design their own game, an action-packed shooter called Big Guns. The project was bought by Sony Computer Entertainment, who then began to make changes. Big Guns was renamed to Exodus, and the design was changed from a mech shooter to an action-adventure game featuring a girl who morphed into a cat creature. Sony canceled the game in November of 1997, and Neversoft shrunk down to just 12 employees. In January 2008, Neversoft was nearly out of funds, but was saved by Activision. Activision was looking for someone to develop a game called Apocalypse and saw promise in the Big Guns game engine. Neversoft signed on to design Apocalypse, and Activision also requested Neversoft to develop a prototype of a skateboarding game. Development was mainly focused on creating Apocalypse, but the skateboarding prototypes that were made impressed Activision, and after development on Apocalypse had finished, the 15-man team began working on what would later be named Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. The first person to ride a board in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was none other than Bruce Willis. Neversoft started development using the same engine they made for Apocalypse, in which Bruce Willis played the main character. His character model was the first to ride around on a board during the early stages of the games. In fact, Bruce Willis was still on the board when they took the game's first demo to Tony Hawk to try and convince him to join the project. In a quote from co-founder Joel Jewett, he recalls showing Hawk the demo. The first demo, the one we showed to Tony Hawk to get him on board, had Bruce Willis on a skateboard. He was still holding a gun, I think. As the project moved forward, Bruce Willis's model was taken off the board, but lived on for a short while in the downtown level as a statue, which was completely removed by the time of release. Tony Hawk wasn't just a face and a name, though, and after signing his likeness over to Neversoft, he took on an active role in the game's development. Each time Neversoft finished a new build of the game, a copy was sent to Tony Hawk for review. If he saw anything that didn't appear to accurately reflect the skateboarding scene, he would report back to Neversoft. He also participated in motion capture for the game, a process that was mostly abandoned by the time that the second game was released, however would eventually be reincorporated in later Tony Hawk's installments. Customers first got their hands on Tony Hawk's Pro Skater in the form of a demo that appeared on multiple demo discs, including the PlayStation Underground's Jam Pack Summer '99 disc, and a disc given out at Pizza Hut restaurants. The demo allowed players to control Tony Hawk and Bob Burnquist, and featured either the Chicago or warehouse level. The demo was available over 4 months before the full game actually came out, and provided Neversoft with valuable feedback on what changes needed to be made to the finished product. The demo discs also helped create excitement for the game, which contributed to its success upon release. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater first appeared on the PlayStation on August 31st, 1999. In some regions, it was released as Tony Hawk's Skateboarding, as the word skater implies ice skating in some countries. It was then ported to the Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and N-Gage, and an adaptation was released for the Game Boy Color. Not all of the content that was originally intended for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater made it into the game, and not all ports of the game are identical. An early beta version of the game reveals content that was changed or completely removed from the official release. Aesthetic differences between the beta and final release include a change to the splash screen and logo, different fonts on the End Run menu, and that the trick called Fast Plant was originally called Foot Plant. The bonus point items look different as well, appearing as glowing rings in the beta instead of the metallic point icons that appear in the final release. The game's beta also contains 2 levels that were removed completely. The first, a level called Downhill, was a long level without much to do. The objective was to pick up tapes, and although a lot of work appeared to have already been done on the level, it never made it into the final game. The second level, Freeway, was mostly empty. It consisted of part of a highway overpass and not much else. The player could hop off and skate around below the freeway, but it was clear that not much work had been completed on the level, and it was eventually abandoned. Users claiming to have obtained a hacked version of the beta also accessed an area called Test Level. This mysterious and eerie level was mostly devoid of color and had strange physics, allowing the player to ride completely upside down. There is little information available on this level aside from the claim that it was hacked from a direct rip of the beta. Another hacker claimed to be able to skate around the beta levels as a taxi, and even provided a handful of screenshots. Some levels that did make it into the final build of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater had to be scaled back. Both the San Francisco and downtown levels had hidden areas that had to be removed because of size constraints. The ports of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater weren't all identical. Due to the smaller amount of memory available on its cartridges, the Nintendo 64 version had fewer music tracks than the PlayStation version, and some of the songs were reworked and looped to save space. There were also a few changes put in place to accommodate the Nintendo 64's younger user base. Blood was removed, and the names of some of the gaps and transfers were made more appropriate, such as the Handy Gap being changed to the Spanky Gap, the Long Ass Grind being renamed to the Big Daddy Grind, and the Holy Shit becoming Holy Cow. A mysterious cheat code was also put into the Nintendo 64 port of the game. Once it was entered, it would present the player with a black and white photo of a girl. Many have speculated this to be Tony Hawk's then wife Erin Lee, although it doesn't appear to have ever been confirmed, and the code was simply referred to as Girl's Picture. The Dreamcast version of Pro Skater came out on June 29th of the year 2000, nearly a year after it appeared on the PlayStation and mere months before the sequel was released. Despite this, the port received widespread acclaim and was seen by many critics as the best version of the game. The port featured better graphics, more animations, and the Dreamcast VMU displayed score and ratings as the player accumulated points.
Did you know? Despite the fact that Mega Man Legends sold very poorly, producer Keiji Inafune credits the game for his success in the industry. Inafune told attendees of GDC 2012, "I was very excited, very passionate, and very confident about this game. However, the Mega Man series was slightly on the decline, and perhaps the expectation levels were not as high as the previous games. Therefore, we weren't able to sell or promote the game as we expected, and failed to attract an audience." He went on to explain, after the enormous popularity of Resident Evil 2, he might have become intoxicated by his own success and stopped trying as a result, but the commercial failure of Legends grounded him and allowed him to see the importance of rising to the challenge and fighting back.
Legends had a small budget and released earlier than expected. As a result, some ideas had to be scaled back or removed entirely. During the planning stages, the developers intended to include another synthetic life form similar to Mega Man and Juno. Design documents refer to him as Evil Rockman, or by extension Evil Mega Man, and he would have been an enemy not only of Mega Man but also of the Bonds. This early character relation chart also suggests Evil Rockman would have misled Mega Man into believing he was an ally. The developers also planned on including a human rival for Mega Man named Artillery. The official Japanese website had a comment about the character from programmer Katsunori Oida. Back in one of the early scenarios, Rockman was going to have a romantic rival competing for Roll's affection. Dare we say she would have even been charmed by him. Bring Tron into the picture and you'd have an amusing four-sided love triangle. Artillery still appears in the game as a recurring townie with a gun holster, but his role was reduced to that of a background character. Mega Man and his allies were also going to have a fifth crew member aboard the Flutter. She would have been an assistant to Professor Barrel as well as the ship's resident nurse. Early concept art depicts the nurse with a giant syringe for an arm, but later designs took on a more traditional human form. Like Artillery, the character still appears in the final game as a generic NPC.
There is more concept art that reveals an entire unseen world beyond Cadillac's Island, including advanced cities atop enormous cogs. Another illustration depicts a city submerged under the ocean, suggesting the story could have delved below the surface of the flooded world. Another piece of art shows what appears to be a home for the Casket family. Cadillac's Island also looked very different in early designs. The Apple Market was more narrow, but it appeared to go on for longer. The market went through more changes during development, as seen in an early demo of the game that was distributed exclusively in Japan. The stores are on opposite sides, and there are a series of alleyways that are open to the sky. The music store is different, and many of the townspeople have different faces. Mega Man is also shorter in the demo, which is likely due to the character originally being around the age of 10 rather than 14. This early version also has data suggesting some story segments might have been planned to take place at night. Unused graphics left in the demo's game data includes nighttime textures for all of the buildings and objects. The final Japanese name for the game, Rockman Dash, is actually an acronym standing for Dig Outer's Adventure Stories and the Halcyon Days. Dig Outer is the Japanese name for the digger job in the English version, and Halcyon Days refers to a term from Greek mythology. It describes a period of peace that takes place at specific times in the calendar, when storms never occur and the winds and waves are calm. The name Dash was also chosen to commemorate the Mega Man series' 10th anniversary, to symbolize the fact that Mega Man was boldly moving into a new generation of 3D polygonal graphics. A few of the locations in Mega Man Legends were named after developers of the game. The Cardon Forest, or Kadon no Mori in Japanese, was named after Kazunori Kadoi, the game's engine designer and 3D model animator. The Closer Woods, or Kurozo no Mori, gets its name from scenario and event planner Shin Kurosawa. Lake Jin, or Junko, is based on head programmer Masaru Ijuin. And finally, Masahiro Yasuma was the inspiration for the Yas Plains, or Yasu no Sugen in Japanese. At one point in the game, Mega Man is able to tell the shop owner his name is Hippopotamus as a gag. This was added in by planner Shin Kurosawa, and it actually has a hidden meaning. Kurosawa explained on the Capcom dev vlog, the joke is that the Japanese word for hippopotamus is kaba, which is baka when spelled backwards. Baka in Japanese means something along the lines of idiot.
When Rockman Dash was localized for North America, some of the game's content was censored or removed. The comic book from one of Jim's side quests was originally an erotic magazine. The PSP port of Rockman Dash, which was not released overseas, also changes the magazine to a comic book. The Japanese version enabled players to kick non-aggressive dogs as well as shoot birds out of the sky. This was removed in the North American version, likely due to cultural differences.
The Japan-exclusive Rockman Dash Adventure Guidebook revealed information about the design for the servbots that came as a surprise to nobody. They were, in fact, inspired by LEGO characters. The passage also mentions that early on, the servbots were planned to remove their heads and place them on different bodies and vehicles. Capcom developed a bit of an affinity for the servbots and included references to them in many other games. In fact, when Capcom recruits new graphic artists, part of their training is to create 3D servbot models. According to web planner Kineko Akawa, despite the servbot's seemingly simplistic design, getting their facial features and bodily proportions right is actually quite hard.
The tragic news of Capcom pulling the plug on Mega Man Legends 3 in 2011 was especially hard on gamers, as it had been over a decade since the debut of Mega Man Legends 2. However, unknown to many fans in the West, the series had a game released exclusively in Japan as recent as 2008. It was a surprisingly full-featured mobile game starring Mega Man, Roll, and the Bonds. The title roughly translates to Rockman Dash Great Adventure on 5 islands, and the storyline takes place between Legends 1 and 2. Initial downloads began with 2 islands, and the other 3 were released later as downloadable content.
The long-awaited digital re-releases of the first 2 Legends games on the PlayStation Network were thought to be impossible for many years. Capcom told fans they were no longer legally allowed to distribute Mega Man Legends without extra negotiation with additional license holders, all because of a few minor details in the game. The infringing content in question included the soda machines, which used imagery from the real-life brand Orinomen Sea energy drinks, and the YAG building in Uptown, which depicted the logo of the Yoyogi Animation Gakuen, an actual Japanese animation school. During an Ask Capcom livestream, corporate officer Christian Svensson explained that Capcom has a reoccurring issue with games released prior to the year 2000. This was because license contracts at that time didn't consider that games might be re-released in the future. One way to get around this would be to simply change the graphics, but Sony has a strict rule against changing the content of PS1 classics. Despite repeatedly denying that a re-release would ever see the light of day, Capcom eventually worked out the legal details thanks to a few dedicated employees. The game was released digitally for the first time in 2015. Its price was higher than most PS1 classics, likely because of the legal hurdles, but Capcom pointed out that $9.99 was much less than the going rate of used physical copies online.
Did you know? Pepsi Man on the original PlayStation wasn't Pepsi Man's first appearance in a video game. The character had a guest appearance in the Japanese Sega Saturn version of Sega's Fighting Vipers. Unlocking Pepsi Man requires the player to fight against a CPU opponent without pressing any inputs. Pepsi Man will then tag in and fight the player, and beating him will add him to the player select screen. Pepsi Man was included thanks to a deal between Pepsi and Sega, which also added several Pepsi ads throughout the game. Along with Pepsi Man, these ads were removed from the game's international release. Although Pepsi Man's appearance in Fighting Vipers is relatively unknown, there's an even more obscure Pepsi Man game. Between the release of Fighting Vipers and Pepsi Man on the PS1, Sigma Enterprises released a Pepsi Man arcade game. The title was a simple rock-paper-scissors gambling game and released exclusively in Japan in 1997. Although Pepsi Man was created for the Japanese market, the character was designed by a Canadian comic book artist. The character was designed in the mid-90s by Travis Charest, who also contributed to comics in the expanded Star Wars universe. The Pepsi Man ads eventually led to the creation of Pepsi Woman, who only seems to deliver Diet Pepsi drinks to women. In the Pepsi Man commercials, Pepsi Man runs as fast as he can to deliver soda to thirsty people in need, and after delivering the Pepsi, he often injures himself in a slapstick manner. It's believed these traits inspired the PlayStation game's design, as it's a runner game with comical hit animations. Throughout the game, the player is shown real-life cutscenes of a man drinking Pepsi. The actor in these scenes is Mike Butters, who would later land a recurring role in the Saw movies as the character Paul. According to the game's 3D modeler, Kotaro Uchikoshi, the real-world cutscenes were a symptom of the game's small budget. This proved to be a wise decision on behalf of the game's developer Kid, as Pepsi Man reportedly sold poorly. Despite the subpar sales, however, the game did have a chance of being localized in America. According to a 1999 GameSpot article, a notable US publisher was trying to bring the game to the USA. The game ultimately stayed in Japan, which is peculiar seeing as the game is entirely voiced in English. This usually makes video games easier to bring to the West, which suggests that the game's lack of localization was possibly due to licensing issues. In an interview for the Untold History of Japanese Game Developers, Uchikoshi also mentioned some questionable working conditions at Kid. He and a few other developers were stationed at a desk nicknamed the Edge of the Cliff. The name was to remind the group that they were disposable and could be pushed off the team and replaced easily at any time. Although the PlayStation game is rather short, it has a fair amount of unused content such as unused assets and early versions of levels. One of the most noteworthy files is an unused audio clip from the start of a level. The audio is of a cheerleader explaining that she and her team are exhausted and need Pepsi Man to bring them soda to perk the girls up. Several development tools can also be accessed with Action Replay and GameShark codes. The Cutting Room Floor co-admin Devin found a functional level editor within the game's data. The editor allows players to select objects and place them throughout a stage, and levels can even be saved to a memory card. Another tool that can be accessed is a debug menu. This menu gives access to various test features such as a sound test, a texture mapping test, a motion test, an object viewer, an object editor, and the ability to start from any level in the game. One scene from the PlayStation game is directly lifted from a Pepsi Man commercial. In the scene, Pepsi Man is chased by what seems to be a Coca-Cola branded 18-wheeler through San Francisco. Because the game released in 1999, some believe this level directly inspired a scene in Sonic Adventure 2. 2 years after Pepsi Man's release, Sonic Adventure 2 has Sonic being chased by an 18-wheeler through a San Francisco-inspired level.
Did you know? In its earliest stages, Tekken wasn't a fighting game or a video game at all. It was originally a project that experimented with 3D character modeling during the early years of polygonal graphics. The idea of adapting it into a fighting game came after Namco hired several former Sega employees who had previously worked on Virtua Fighter. These employees included Saichi Ishii, who served as the lead producer for Tekken 1 and 2 before passing the reins on to Katsuhiro Harada. The team's goal was to make a game similar to Virtua Fighter, but use fully modeled textures and have the game run at twice Virtua Fighter's frame rate. Early promotional material also showed that the project was named Rave War before the name Tekken was chosen. Tekken has long been associated with Sony's PlayStation consoles and didn't appear on competitors' hardware until 2001 with Tekken Advance. According to the series producer Katsuhiro Harada, this was due to similarities between the original PlayStation hardware and the arcade cabinets Tekken was built for. Harada also told Polygon that Namco only brought the series to non-Sony platforms when the demand was high enough. Some of the stranger mini-games in the Tekken series began as off-the-wall ideas from the developers. In an interview with Silicon Era, Harada mentioned that Tekken Force, first introduced in Tekken 3, came from a simple side idea, stating, "We wanted to have Tekken characters side-scroll through stages and pick up meat to replenish health. At the beginning, that's what we wanted to do. I know it sounds silly and it's hard to see the purpose, but I really wanted to do that." Tekken Ball, which was also introduced in Tekken 3, was originally designed as a simulation to help practice air juggling. Harada stated, "The original idea was to hit the ball and juggle it to a basket, sort of like basketball. It didn't go how I imagined and I was kind of frustrated. If it's not going to be good, I thought I should make it into a versus game." The minigame had to be developed by a small team of 3, including Harada himself, so that the other staff could continue working on the main game. The development of Tekken Ball led Harada to experiment with similar minigame ideas, including a pinball minigame. He ultimately believed a bowling bowling minigame where players took turns felt more appropriate, leading to the addition of Tekken Bowl in Tekken Tag Tournament. Tekken 3's arcade release contains a trio of unused characters in the game's data. This includes 2 new characters named Sake and Insect, and Tekken 2's Jun Kazuma. When asked about Sake, Harada stated that he had the idea of making a playable salmon that could only splash around helplessly while making flapping noises. Because it cost 100 yen, about $1, for each play at the arcade, Sake was cut. Namco didn't want players to feel cheated out of their money by playing as a character that couldn't fight at all. Insect, on the other hand, was the result of a bug in the game's coding. According to Harada, the bug made characters' arms, legs, and waist shrink to thin sizes, making them resemble a praying mantis. Development on Insect was quickly dropped, however, due to the large amount of resources being used to make the other new characters. One of Tekken 3's endings was censored for the European and American versions of the game. In the original Japanese version of Tekken 3, Nina Williams' ending shows she and her sister Anna sunbathing. Several men show up to impress her, and Anna receives most of the attention. Out of jealousy, Nina unhooks Anna's bikini top in front of the men, walking away with a smirk. In the European and American versions, however, Nina's ending was changed to her ignoring the men completely, with Anna walking away with a smile instead. Minor controversy affected the release of Tekken 6 as well. In the South Korean version of Tekken 6 Bloodline Rebellion, Alyssa's design had notable alterations, changing her retractable chainsaws into lightsaber-esque beam swords. This version also removed all instances of Alyssa detaching her head, most likely to comply with the country's strict laws on violent content. Debates arose over Leo Kleeson and whether or not the character was male or female. Before the release of Tekken 6, both Bandai Namco and Katsuhiro Harada stated that Leo was designed to be gender neutral, as they felt that the roster needed a character players will love regardless of gender. And within the final version of Tekken 6, Leo is referred to with gender neutral terms. Leo's gender was kept secret until a 2011 promotional event held in Cologne, Germany, for the movie Tekken Blood Vengeance. During the event, Harada took to the stage and revealed that Leo was female, a fact soon confirmed within subsequent games such as Tekken Tag Tournament 2. The announcement of Tekken 7's new fighters sparked especially mixed reception in the West when Lucky Chloe was revealed, including complaints that the character was a furry Vocaloid idol. Harada, in response to the negative Western reaction, took to Twitter stating, "I'll make a muscular and skinhead character for you. Remember, I said we've more new characters and she is one of them," and that Lucky Chloe would be exclusive to the Japanese version. While the statement was intended as a joke, several gaming news outlets reported on Lucky Chloe's exclusivity as fact until Harada confirmed that she was, in fact, in all versions of the game. Harada was particularly careful with another one of Tekken 7's newcomers, the Saudi Arabian fighter Shaheen. He intended to include the Arabian character in the Tekken series roster as early as 2009, but wanted to visit the region first to get a better sense of its people and culture. He even took to social media asking for feedback from Middle Eastern fans to help with Shaheen's final design. Shaheen was met with very positive reception, even appearing in regional newspapers such as Al Ayam in Bahrain. This reception led Harada to encourage his close friend and fellow producer Yoshiniro Ono to include a Middle Eastern character in the roster of Street Fighter V, leading to the announcement of Rashid shortly after. The Tekken series is also known for its Easter eggs. In Tekken 4's Tekken Force mode, 4 enemies in the final level are named Anthony, John, Chad, and Flea, after members of the American rock band Red Hot Chili Peppers. In Paul Phoenix and Brian Fury's Tekken 3 stage, a piece of graffiti in the background reads Soul Edge. This is a reference to Soul Blade, another 3D fighting game by Namco, originally named Soul Edge in Japan, and the originator of the Soul Calibur series. Tekken 5's Final Frontier stage has an LED monitor in the background that will, on occasion, show a sprite of Pac-Man. Tekken Tag Tournament 2, however, caused slight controversy over one of its stage designs. The Saudi Arabian stage, Modern Oasis, included a floor decoration with the word Allah written in Arabic. This prompted a negative response from Muslim players, since both stepping on God's name and using God's name in an unnecessary manner are both considered highly disrespectful acts in Islam. When players brought the issue to Katsuhiro Harada's attention on Twitter, he formally apologized for the mistake, and the Arabic writing was removed in an update. This was not the first time the Tekken series had run into potential controversy though. Tekken 3 featured a guest fighter named Gon, a fire-breathing dinosaur from a manga series of the same name. Despite the character receiving negative reception at first, he became one of the most requested characters for future titles, most notably Tekken Tag Tournament 2. This led Harada to repeatedly state on Twitter that the character was only allowed in Tekken 3 because of a one-time license and would be very unlikely to make a return appearance. This same license was one of the reasons preventing Tekken 3 from being added to the European PlayStation Store.
Hideo Kojima is one of the few video game designers that needs no introduction, with his rich plethora of games from Zone of the Enders to the upcoming Death Stranding and of course his Metal Gear series. Fans have collected, obsessed over and attempted to play every game that has his name attached. This hasn't been a problem, as all his games have been released and translated outside of Japan, with the exception of one. Today we're talking about Policenauts. Policenauts was released in 1994 for the NEC PC 9821, with a 3DO port a year later and a release on the PlayStation and Sega Saturn in 1996. Most people consider the Sega Saturn release to be the definitive version of the game for its updated visuals, light gun support, and the inclusion of bonus content. Policenauts is presented through a crime noir cyberpunk aesthetic, taking inspiration from films such as Blade Runner and Lethal Weapon. The game follows the story of Jonathan Ingram, a member of the Policenauts, a group of 5 astronauts with extensive police training who are assigned to protect Beyond Coast, the first functioning space colony in the year 2013. While testing a new spacesuit, an accident causes Jonathan to drift from his craft into deep space. Though presumed dead by his team, Jonathan survived the incident with the assistance of a deep sleep module built into his suit, leaving him in a deep slumber for 24 years, waking in the year 2037. 3 years after his rescue, Jonathan, who has taken up the profession of a private detective in Old Los Angeles, is visited by his ex-wife Lorraine. She asks Jonathan to assist in solving the case of her missing husband, Kenzo Hojo. The only clues to his avail are a torn leaf, a small collection of pills, and the word Plato. After leaving Jonathan's office, Lorraine is murdered by a man wearing a motorcycle helmet. Unable to catch the assailant, and despite his initial reluctance, Jonathan decides to take on her final request. Jonathan travels to Beyond, reuniting with his old partner from the LAPD, Ed Brown. The two set out to investigate the suspicious circumstances surrounding both Hojo's disappearance and Lorraine's murder. While primarily a graphic adventure game, Policenauts also includes puzzle solving and even shooting. With the game's Saturn release, new features were added to allow the player to use the console's Virtua gun, known as the Stunner in North America, and play these sections as a light gun shooter. The game features a brief bomb disposal section and other smaller sides to the main game. When it comes to investigation, the player is able to inspect objects and question characters multiple times in order to uncover additional information, opening extra dialogue and descriptions. This is a necessity, as often the game restricts progress unless the player probes for more information or investigates all elements of a scene. With certain choices changing the tones and mood of characters, the player's actions can alter the responses that they get. This opens the possibility for multiple ways of progressing through the game. Hideo Kojima's classic style is obviously present throughout the game, with its film-like cutscenes, extensive dialogue, and tendency to break the fourth wall. Policenauts is the first of his games to include summary screens, which remind the player of the plot when loading a save file. It is also the first time he introduces each of the key characters with their name and the voice actor who plays them. Kojima explained how Policenauts came to be in an interview with The Guardian. While working on Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2, Kojima expressed there was difficulty asking programmers to implement very specific dialogue or music cues because he found that they would work to their own style or timing. He stated, "It was hugely frustrating making games at that time for me. I wanted to control everything. So after the second Metal Gear launched, I developed my own scripting engine and decided to work on adventure games so that I could have complete control over when the animation played or when the music was triggered. That's when I developed Snatcher and Policenauts. It was a way to take creative control back from the programmers." Initially conceived under the title Beyond, Konami were unable to claim a copyright on just a single standard word, and thus the game became Policenauts. The game was also originally going to be listed under the new genre of cinematic virtual reality. This had to be changed to interactive cinema, however, as the term virtual reality had already been trademarked. 4 Japanese voice artists went on to have roles in Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation 1. Hideyuki Tanaka, the voice of Jonathan Ingram in Policenauts, also voiced Hal Emmerich or Otacon. Kaneto Shiozawa, who plays Tony Redwood, voiced Grey Fox. Naoko Nakamura plays the BCCH receptionist and played Sniper Wolf. And lastly, Masaharu Sato, who played Salvatore Toscanini, featured as Donald Anderson in MGS. However, it wasn't just voice actors that Kojima carried over into the Metal Gear Solid series. A sample of the End of the Dark track from the Police Not soundtrack is played over the Konami Computer Entertainment logo screen in Metal Gear Solid. Meryl Silverberg also features in the game as part of Vice Unit. Though she isn't actually the same character that's featured in Metal Gear Solid, she has a very similar appearance, and she was the last member of Foxhound before it was disbanded after the fall of Zanzibarland. Incidentally, Metal Gear Solid 4 also references Vice Unit by having Meryl wear a bullet earring like she does in Police Noughts. The Rat Patrol Team 01 consists of Jonathan and Ed in reference to the main characters Jonathan Ingram and the Chief of Vice Ed Brown, who themselves appear to be inspired by Riggs and Murtaugh from the Lethal Weapon series of films. Meryl also wears Dave Forrest's orange jacket in the end scene of Metal Gear Solid, at the same time as Solid Snake also reveals his name to be David. Drebin893 of Metal Gear Solid 4's favourite soda is Narc, the same name as the addictive drug in Police Noughts. Otacon seems to be a big fan of Police Noughts. In Metal Gear Solid, he has posters of the game on his wall, and it's even visually referenced when discussing bipedal tanks. And in Metal Gear Solid 4, it's Otacon's PC desktop wallpaper in the Nomad. The exoskeletons worn by various ninjas throughout the Metal Gear Solid series are made by Tokugawa Heavy Industries, a company featured in Police Noughts. These are just a few references Kojima has included in the Metal Gear Solid series. Kojima also lent his own voice to the game in a brief cameo as an AP officer in the shootout at Tokugawa Industries. The game also references other titles published by Konami, such as a shelf of CDs containing musical tracks from different games. While this area is only a minor part of the overall release, it actually takes up a large amount of the game's disk space, totaling 1/6 of the game's overall size. When it came to producing the game, concerns were raised with how much could ultimately be included, with this section being considered the easiest to cut back should storage issues arise. In the opening cutscene of the game, a neon sign can be seen in the background of one of the images that reads Solid Snake. Even Jonathan Ingram's surname could be a reference to the Ingram Mach 11, the submachine gun that is featured in both Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2. There are also several references to Kojima's previous adventure game, Snatcher. In Ishida's pharmacy, the player can see a Snatcher calendar hanging on the end of a row of shelves. A message on Jonathan's answering machine plays music from a club Outer Heaven featured in Snatcher. A newspaper article on Jonathan's wall is from the Neo Kobe newspaper. Neo Kobe is the fictional city in which Snatcher takes place. Also, in the game Tokimeki Memorial, which was also produced by Hideo Kojima, it is possible to watch a movie of Police Noughts. Again, there are plenty more references throughout these games, these are just some of the least obscure. As previously mentioned, there are numerous versions of the game. The initial NEC PC release was the only version to feature the hand-drawn pixel art, as the computer rendered all graphics in real time. These graphics were completely overhauled for the 3DO release and all subsequent releases. The special edition of the 3DO version came bundled with a mouse and an official Police Noughts mouse mat. Shortly before this release, Konami put out a demo in the form of a pilot disc. The disc also contained various interviews with voice actors and developers, and even an in-depth encyclopedia about the world of Police Noughts. Some of this information came included as extra content in both the PlayStation and Saturn versions. Other than the light gun support for the Saturn and the increased frame rate of the cutscenes from 24 frames per second from the PlayStation's 15 frames per second, there are few differences between these final releases of the game. Hideo Kojima opposed one change in particular relating to the player's ability to jiggle women's breasts, as Shuhei Yoshida, the CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment, found it excessive. Kojima recalled this in an interview with Famitsu. I was contacted by Sony Computer Entertainment, who told me, "We're going to decide in an upcoming meeting how many times breasts can jiggle." I argued over and over with them, saying that's absurd. In the end, we worked things out, but I'll never forget arguing over the breast jiggle issue. In the PlayStation version of the game, the animation of the jiggling was reduced, and the player had fewer opportunities to do it. While Policenauts never received an official English release, there was a time when a release overseas was considered. This is confirmed by the presence of an English press release on Konami's official website in 1996, claiming the game to be a sequel to Kojima's Snatcher on the Sega Saturn. The game also had an English mock-up cover shot produced and printed in several promotional pamphlets for Sega games packed with other Saturn titles. However, according to translator Jeremy Blaustein, who had worked on the official translation of both Snatcher and Metal Gear Solid, rumours of an official partially completed Policenauts translation script were false. He said, "It's false as far as I know. I was in the international business department at Konami when it came out, and I never heard of any plans to release in the US then or since." Contradicting this, according to Kojima, the international version was worked on, but the developers weren't able to sync the game's English dialogue with the animated cutscenes, though the legitimacy of this claim cannot be confirmed. While the game ultimately never saw a North American release, in the end it would be up to the fans to create their own translation, the first of which being the PlayStation version of the game. The project had a long development period, with Mark Laidlaw, not to be confused with the writer of Half-Life, and Artemio Urbina translating much of the dialogue. They worked on this in the summer of 2007, but encountered problems when it came to programming their translation into the game itself. It would be a year before Something Awful forum user Slow Beef began working on getting the script inserted into the game, leading to a revival of the project which would come to completion in 2009. Despite the PlayStation version being considered an inferior release to the Saturn, it would be a number of years before another translation would surface for the Sega console instead, once again built upon the translation work from Mark Laidlaw.
In October of 1998, Asmic Ace Entertainment developed and published a game that to this day still perplexes the gaming community. LSD Dream Emulator is an obscure title that nobody in the West could play at the time of its release, but has since picked up a small cult following. We'll start our coverage with a quick look at LSD's gameplay. LSD is controlled from a first-person perspective and has the player explore surreal environments. With no interactive objects, the game simply allows the player to move around the environments with simple navigation controls. The game's purpose is simple: to explore. It's possible to teleport to different environments by walking into various objects. The object itself isn't important, however, as everything will teleport the player, including walls. This teleportation is known as linking, and it's believed that walking into living creatures or surreal items will link the player to more obscure locations. The game's premise sees the player walking around a dream world. The world was conceived by the mind of Hiroko Nishikawa, an artist at Asmic Ace Entertainment who kept a journal of her dreams for over a decade. Osamu Sato, the game's director, took those dreams and conceived mechanics that would let people explore such a world. Dreams come to an end automatically after around 10 minutes. There are other ways of ending a dream, however, such as falling off of a cliff. After a dream has ended and the player has woken up, they are presented with a graph. This graph is designed to keep track of the player's dreams and will reveal the overall theme of the dreams they've had. These are tracked as upper, downer, static, and dynamic. It's also believed that previously played dreams can have an impact on the player's subsequent dreams. The graph may be based on the actions taken while sleeping, but which slot on the graph is filled seems almost arbitrary, as constantly moving or staying still has little effect on the dynamic and static trackers. Environments found in the game can change on a regular basis. The dream world is made up of a static map that doesn't change, and tunnels allow the player to travel between areas. Navigation is inconsistent, however, as walking into the same object multiple times can teleport the player to different locations. On top of that, the textures in each environment can also change. These textures may even change while the player is near them, such as eyes appearing on walls that stare at the player. After a number of days dreaming, the game allows the player to re-explore old dreams. This is one of the only ways to see the same dream twice, as the game's randomized nature doesn't allow for easily repeated interactions. While normal dreams last 10 minutes, revisited dreams seem to only last around 3 minutes. Some dreams are non-interactive and are just videos the player can watch. These are so far-fetched that they only serve to increase the confusing nature of the game. Some dreams even remove the video aspect altogether and are simply black screens with Japanese characters covering them. These screens tell stories and can often seem to make little sense. The game's producer, Osamu Sato, wrote the soundtrack for the game himself. The game contains over 500 different patterns of music, which change depending on the dream's theme. These patterns are just a number of variations of the same simple tunes, and use a collection of different electronic sound effects. The soundtrack was given away with the limited edition release of the game as a bonus CD called Lucy in the Sky with Dynamites. This is a parody of the Beatles track Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which was also known for having the acronym LSD, albeit unintentionally. A book containing excerpts of the Dream Journal, written by Nishikawa, was also given away with this limited edition release. Each excerpt is presented alongside a piece of artwork created by various artists. A second album of the game's soundtrack was released on 2 CDs in Japan under the Japanese techno label Music Mine. Titled LSD and Remixes, not only does this soundtrack include music found in the game, but also features remixes performed by multiple artists. This includes British IDM pioneer Mike Paradinas, Finnish jazz performer Jimmy Tenor, and Japanese DJ Ken Ishii. Many people incorrectly took the game's title, LSD, to be a reference to the drug lysergic acid dithylamide, also known by the street name acid or LSD. This is likely because of the game's trippy nature, which parallels the effects of taking LSD. The title's LSD acronym is given different meanings throughout the game and related material, but at no point is it stated to be a reference to drugs. The acronyms that are actually used include In Life, the sensuous dream, and In Limbo, the silent dream. It's commonly believed that the game has no ending. Some players found a file titled ending.str on the game's disk, which is a type of PlayStation video file. This led to discovering that, after going through 365 different dreams, the game will actually play this file. However, the video itself is confusing, and seems to have no relevance to anything in the game. It is speculated that the video symbolizes a Hatsuyumi. In Japanese culture, a Hatsuyumi is the first dream somebody has in a new year. It's considered good luck to dream of 3 things in particular: Mount Fuji, a hawk, and an eggplant, the 3 items shown in the game's ending. After the clip is finished, the day counter seen on the game's main menu will reset back to day 1. The game received a cult following after Let's Play videos began to surface on YouTube in 2009. Players were intrigued by the strange and confusing worlds they were shown. One fan of the game, Figglewatts, even created an unofficial remake of the game called LSD Revamped. Still in early alpha, the unofficial remake plans to introduce new features such as original areas and mod support. The reason for the game's lack of localization in the West has never been confirmed. However, it's possible that there simply wasn't a market for this type of game in the 1990s. Osamu Sato had previously created a game called Eastern Mind: The Lost Souls of Tong Nao. The game had a similarly bizarre presentation, and is believed to have sold poorly in the West. The title even had a sequel, Chu Teng, that never left Japan. It's possible that the poor sales of Eastern Mind in the West indicated that it wouldn't be worth the investment to release LSD and Chu Teng outside of Japan. However, LSD did receive a digital release on PSN in 2010, again restricted only to Japan. With digital distribution allowing for publishers to release region-locked titles to wider audiences for little investment, it seems curious that the game never made it to digital stores in the West. The once Japan exclusive, Shoeniki Kyukyoko Muteki Jinsha Saikyo Otoko was released on the US PlayStation Store in 2010. Interestingly, the game was untouched, and had all of its original Japanese text intact. This seems to relate to Sony's policies regarding PS1 classics on the PlayStation Store. Previously, Capcom had issues with a Sony policy that didn't allow changes to be made to PS1 classics. Capcom wanted to modify several textures to remove previous product placement in Mega Man Legends, but ended up resolving the legal issues with the copyright holders instead. Shoeniki's lack of translation lines up with this policy, and could mean that Japanese games aren't allowed to update their contents if they're published as PS1 classics in the US. If that's the case, LSD had several text-heavy dreams that would need to remain Japanese, assuming it was brought to the American PlayStation Store. If Osamu Sato believed that understanding these messages was integral to part of LSD's experience, he may have opted to not bring the game to the West. We decided to contact Osamu Sato to comment on the game's lack of localization, hoping that he could give us some insight. Sato confirmed to us that LSD never came to the West because it was expected to sell poorly outside of Japan. However, he didn't know why the game was never brought to the American PlayStation Store, and implied that that decision was down to Sony.
Throughout the years creating this show, we've written about several titles that have done a great job of confusing not just you guys, but also ourselves. games which are perhaps more experimental than the typical types of releases which received commercial publication in English-speaking territories. Some of these games have widespread acknowledgement within the wider gaming community already, such as games like LSD Dream Emulator, which puts a huge strain on all of a player's senses, the least of which is their mental capacity to identify what is actually happening. As with many Japanese artistic endeavors, the translation and relocalization of such concepts often proves hard for audiences to digest. Today, we're going to take a look at a game which still continues to baffle us, with its incredibly strange setting, gameplay, and graphics. A game which is surely created for the sole purpose of making the player feel uneasy. We'll be taking a look at Paranoiascape. Released for the Sony PlayStation in 1998, Paranoiascape is the only game ever to be developed and published by Matilda, a company that was likely founded specifically just to create this title. Before talking about the game, we should explain some of the mental thought that went behind its creation. One name in particular stands out amongst the credits, and indeed above the game's title on the front cover: Screaming Mad George. Credited with the game's creature design, music, and concept, Screaming Mad George is a person that deserves the brunt of our attention. Screaming Mad George is the nickname of Joji Tani, a Japanese man who emigrated to the United States. His works are rather noteworthy within the film industry, with his specialist skills working on special effects and makeup, not somebody with any experience creating video games. He had taken on the name of George in order to stand out amongst the crowd, and when moving to the US, changed his moniker to Screaming Mad George in order to further distinguish himself. His career started with music, taking center stage as the vocalist for the late 70s New York shock punk band The Mad. This band's success and the shock value from their gory music videos led to him transitioning to the silver screen, with notable starts such as Big Trouble in Little China and the original Predator. He would even go on to direct his own film in '91, The Guyver, which had to be recut by New Line Cinema in order to remove some of his wicked sense of humor. The truth is, George has a passion for the bizarre and the shock of gore within art, working with artists that he likely has a keen interest in himself, such as assisting in the music videos for Cypress Hill's Dr. Green Thumb or 9 Inch Nails' Closer. Putting it bluntly, Screaming Mad George loves designing disturbing creatures and visuals, using a style that he calls anti-realism. Perhaps George's most seen designs within the music industry, though likely unrecognized as his creation, is his work forming the faces and masks of the band Slipknot. George's work is most recognizably handmade, with digital artist tools being left aside. So, with this being a show about regional exclusive games, perhaps it's time that we look at what Screaming Mad George had to offer the video game industry. If a hugely influential artist within the special effects industry was to create a game, one particular genre is unlikely to be the first idea that springs to mind: pinball. One thing that this title does to differentiate itself from typical pinball titles, however, is changing the game's perspective to be entirely within the first person. The player's perspective comes from behind the game's flippers, but on top of that, the player is also capable of moving around, not just side to side, but also back and forth. However, the camera's orientation is fixed. In regards to the game's plot, there actually is one, though it cannot be found within the game itself, only the instruction manual. In Makai, or the Demon World, there has been a struggle to find a suitable replacement for the Demon King. It is decided that a replacement would need to be recruited from the Makai citizens, so in order to identify suitable candidates, the Makai government conducted tests and screened the applicants. 2 skeleton brothers from the countryside are finally selected, and the reigning king told these brothers that while they may have managed to get this far in the tests, the final test is in the Paranoiascape. Only then can they reign as the Demon King's true successor. The brothers obtained the Tobanejo, a flipperbat that has been handed down through the Makai since ancient times. The game's general goal is to rack up points whilst also trying to get to the end of a linear stage, making sure to keep the ball, known as the brain ball, in play in front of the player, never allowing it to fall behind. In total, the game contains 9 stages, each having their own specified goal. While the first level requires the player to merely reach the end of the stage, the game's second level introduces a boss that must be defeated before progressing. This isn't quite as simple as any typical pinball game that has broached this concept, as the player also has a life bar which can deplete from damage. While it is mostly simple to avoid being damaged, there are a number of creatures within this world that wish to harm you, and the player must keep their wits about them. Fans of the pinball genre won't find the title's gameplay to be particularly alluring. There's little in the way of unique mechanics to the game besides its perspective, with paddles being the only real sense of control otherwise. However, Paranoia Escape clearly was not created to define itself as the pinnacle of the genre. Playing the title, it isn't the craft of code that makes up all of its merits, but the world created from the strange mind of Screaming Mad George. A world where the walls have literal ears, the floor seems only too keen to scream at you as you attempt to pass over it, and the sky watches you as you navigate a corridor of filth. Needless to say, the game's visuals are possibly some of the most nightmarish of their generation, and even today leaves an unsettling feeling. There are so many elements to build up what makes this game's setting seem so unnatural, and trying to define the style of horror that the game encompasses is almost impossible. The only way of describing it is to take a page of George's own dictionary and simply summarize it as anti-realistic. As you'd expect from somebody who gives themselves the title of Screaming Mad, the game is not simply horrific or disgusting, but also rather humorous, something that lends itself to its surreal nature, backed up once again by the odd choice to have the player explore this designed world through the genre of pinball. The game's audio also lends itself to the brutal domination of one's senses, with creatures making strange, unnatural noises over the musical vibes of punk rock and industrial. The game's last stage takes a strange turn from the rest of the title, putting the player in control of some sort of amalgamation of a baby on wheels from a top-down perspective, as they recover the souls of both a king and queen and put them to rest, before they appear to be reborn as the origin of life. A new life is established, and we are told this is the end of Screaming Mad George's surreal world. Paranoia Escape's name comes from the title of a song created by Screaming Mad George and Psychosis, created in 1992, 6 years before this game's creation. Screaming Mad George hasn't spoken at much length about the game's existence, with what appears to be the only direct reference to its existence on his own website found in his full library of creations. Interestingly, however, he mentions that the game doesn't simply serve as playable software on the Sony PlayStation, but that it also serves as a playable audio CD. Some film fanatics may actually notice references to some of George's earlier works, like the 1989 film Society, with several images seemingly taken directly from the title, like a face found in place of a butthole. George himself even appears within the game as a giant face that appears in the sky. In our view, Paranoia Escape is not a game which warrants any particularly substantial price tag. The game is basic, and considerably short, even by retro standards. A typical playthrough could be completed in a mere half hour. But what the player experiences isn't something so simply defined as just another pinball game, but really a work of art. Since we saw this game's existence several years ago, it's continued to hold a place within our minds, and we could never get it out. Despite the game's ending leaving the player with a to be continued until next time message, no sequel was ever created. In regards to why this game wasn't released internationally, it does beg for some clear reasoning. Screaming Mad George may have been born in Japan, but his work as an artist definitely thrived within the United States. However, as Paranoia Escape remains exclusive within Japan, the only reasoning that we've been able to come to was that the game was simply far too experimental as a concept for Sony of America. Or perhaps, George was more interested in creating the product in the gaming space for its artistic merits, rather than as a profitable commercial venture, not wishing to try and localize the game outside of Japan. However, with this said, by looking through the game's data, it's possible to uncover audio of George himself. As previously mentioned, during the game, George appears as a head in the sky, guiding the player as they make guesses on how to progress past a series of faces. Hitting the incorrect face has him talk to the player in Japanese. However, looking through the data, unused audio of English can also be found.
Go forward, man! Come on, go straight ahead!
Suggesting that there was at least some consideration of an English release at some stage of development. Each voice sample has a corresponding English version, making it highly likely that these were recorded with the intention of being used in an English release. We attempted to contact Screaming Mad George several weeks ago and received a response from his PR company, who said they would pass our questions on to him. However, as we have not heard anything back, we can only assume that George is currently preoccupied. This video was created during the coronavirus lockdown, so it's possible that he is just simply unable to find the time to get back to us. If we do receive a response, we will pin a comment with his answers to our questions. Be sure to follow Did You Know Gaming on Twitter, and we will update you if we hear anything back.
Japan has a large quantity of platformers that never left the region, but typically these games were made during the 8 and 16-bit eras. 2D platformers became less common after the PlayStation's release, as games tried making use of the console's 3D capabilities. One 2D platformer America never received was Chipoke Ralph no Daiboken, otherwise known as The Adventure of Little Ralph. The Adventure of Little Ralph was released for the PlayStation in 1999 and was developed by New Corporation, a team with few projects to its name. The title's gameplay and style are reminiscent of the arcade era of platformers, and people often think that the game is an arcade port. However, Little Ralph was created exclusively for the PlayStation. The game follows Ralph, an 18-year-old orphan. When his village is attacked by a demon army known as the Lost Clan, Ralph tries to defend it. However, he comes up against the leader of the clan, the powerful Valgo, a demon obsessed with his muscles. Valgo casts a spell that strips Ralph of his gear and turns him into a child. Before Valgo manages to throw the finishing blow, Ralph's childhood friend Letitia shows up to protect him, unleashing a powerful magical ability that she's kept hidden for all those years. Letitia saves Ralph, but is instead kidnapped by Valgo. Naked and helpless, Ralph finds a magical holy sword on the battlefield that guides him to save his friends and defeat the Lost Clan. The game works like a typical action platformer, with Ralph being able to run, jump, and swing his sword. Ralph can also pick up a shield that grants him one additional hit before he dies. He can also find power-ups for his sword which widen his range, or cause fireballs to shoot from his sword when he swings. Along the way, Ralph can find a small animal friend, Fierio, that helps him by throwing small explosives. The game uses a score system, and points are gained by collecting fruit or killing enemies. Points can also be multiplied by charging Ralph's sword attack. Ralph will then use it like a bat, knocking enemies in a straight line into one another, and multiplying the points earned. Initially, the game's boss battles must be beaten as young Ralph. About halfway through the game, however, Ralph gains the power to temporarily turn back into an adult during boss battles. When he does this, the boss battles switch genre and become similar to a fighting game. Specifically, the gameplay is close to a classic Street Fighter title, with less concentration on combos and more on performing special attacks. It isn't particularly complex compared to most standalone fighting games, but it offers an interesting twist on the game as it progresses. After completing the game, a new versus mode is unlocked. This allows you to play as Ralph or the bosses against a friend. Other elements expand the replayability too. For example, the player can't get the full ending on the easy difficulty, which features only 5 levels compared to the normal mode's 8. We'll refrain from showing you the true ending for those who wish to play through the game themselves. The Adventure of Little Ralph received a widely positive response, with reviewers finding the 2D graphics and flow admirable for the time of release. Many also felt that it was fairly hard, even on the easiest setting. The game's seamless transition between levels were highly praised. It cleverly hid loading screens by showing an animation of Ralph entering the next stage. The adventure of Little Ralph began life as a sharp X68000 home computer title. The game only moved to the PlayStation after the X68000 became redundant, and this is likely why the game has a very retro feel. In 1999, video games were moving away from the simplistic 2D platformers, instead opting for flashy 3D graphics and new styles of gameplay. In contrast, Ralph's origins are apparent with its points and lives system. Games released in the late 90s normally forego a score system entirely and use a save system instead of lives and continues. One interesting feature is found in the game's option menu, where the game's sound mode can be set to PSG, reminiscent of older audio chips instead of the higher quality audio found in PlayStation games. There are a few reasons why Little Ralph never came to the West when it was first published. That being said, there's no official response for which reason is most accurate. As explained before, this game wasn't intended to push the PlayStation's hardware at all, and was instead a throwback to the days of platforming gaming. When Sony was designing the original PlayStation, they were convinced 3D was the future after seeing Sega's Virtua Fighter in action. This belief shaped not only the PlayStation's hardware, but which games appeared on the platform. In the West, many people wanted to see the latest and greatest in gaming technology, which usually meant the most cutting-edge 3D graphics. Sony shared this mentality, at least in the West, and limited the amount of 2D games that appeared on its platforms. This made it difficult for developers who wanted to localize their 2D games for the Western market. One of these developers is SNK's Yoshihito Koyama, who was the director of the Japan-US relations on many of the 2D SNK titles. In 2004, Koyama told Spong.com, "Sony just isn't interested in 2D games anymore, whatever it might be, and yet many games, as long as they are in 3D, trickle through all the time. It's a crazy situation, and we don't believe it reflects the needs of the game consumers." Little Ralph was released in 1999, not too long before Koyama made this statement. It wouldn't be hard to imagine how this mentality would stop a 2D PlayStation game coming to Western shores at the turn of the millennium. To add fuel to the fire, the companies involved in developing and publishing Little Ralph were both very small, and to this date haven't ever had an international release. They would have lacked the power and experience necessary to deal with Sony's stance on 2D. Another reason for the game's lack of localization could be that in 1999, people were eagerly awaiting Sony's next big console, the PlayStation 2. They might have thought that bringing a game from an unknown brand to a dying platform wasn't worth the risk. Curiously, while researching Little Ralph, we discovered its official website is not only presented in Japanese, but also English. This could suggest that the game was intended at one point to be brought to the West, perhaps at the same time as it was distributed online in Japan as a digital download for the Japanese PlayStation Store in 2007.
Survival games are a dime a dozen these days. How they play, however, hasn't always remained the same. In more recent times, one could argue that the survival subgenre has relied mostly on crafting items and utilizing limited resources in order to overcome a hazardous environment. However, before the genre's popularization, one PlayStation title, released exclusively in Japan, decided to include this gameplay style in a genre that it's often not applied to: point and click. So, today, we will be looking at Aconcagua. Aconcagua was developed and published as a Sony Computer Entertainment first-party title, exclusive to Japan in the year 2000. The game takes place in the fictional country Maruza, based upon and named after a real province of Argentina called Mendoza. Maruza is in the midst of political disturbance after the results of an independence movement amongst its citizens. Maruza has been split in half politically as a result. Pachamama, a 33-year-old activist, has taken a flight as part of a tour to promote the independence movement, during which a terrorist organization detonates a bomb on the plane, causing it to crash close to Aconcagua's peak, a large, perilous mountain. Only 5 of the plane's inhabitants survive the crash, and they must all work together to survive the events that follow. The player takes on the role of Kato, a Japanese journalist who has been covering Pachamama's story. After the crash, Kato is tasked with guiding the flight's survivors down the mountain with the help of Pachamama. As they work to escape the clutches of the harsh mountainous conditions, the terrorists continue to try to eliminate the survivors after discovering their initial plan had failed. Kato and Pachamama are joined by Steve, Julia, and Lopez. Steve is an anxious engineer with a number of great skills for survival. Julia is also a journalist like Kato, though coming from the United States. She is in pursuit of a story following the expected coup d'etat. Lopez is the last member to join the group, a hench native with great strength, capable of moving even some of the largest obstacles the team find in their way. The game plays from a third-person perspective. Players must solve various problems and puzzles alongside survival. Much like any point-and-click game, a mouse cursor is used to control the character's movements. When hovering over a character, it changes to a smiley face, indicating you can talk to them, and if the cursor changes to an exclamation mark, the player can interact with the environment. Much of the game's situations requires the player to switch between the various survivors in order to accomplish certain tasks, with each having their own particular set of special skills. Kato, he has a passion for the mountains, so his abilities tend to revolve around mountaineering. Specifically, with the use of some gloves that he finds, he is able to climb certain areas. Julia, she has knowledge of some of the bases situated in the mountain. She has a knife and a lighter, so her skills involve being able to light up certain areas, setting things alight, and is the only character who can take out guards with said knife. Steve, he finds a toolbox, and though he may be riddled with self-doubt and paranoia, he is capable of fixing most electrical devices that cause an obstacle. Pachamama, she can speak Spanish, and so she has the capability to interpret or trick guards with the language. She also uses this skill to translate any Spanish reading material found throughout the ordeal. Lopez, the last person to join the team. He is tall and strong. This is pretty much his entire skill set. Rather than just relying on their abilities to solve problems, the player must actively have characters communicate with each other to push through their struggle. By talking amongst themselves, characters can communicate more effectively, providing their opinions and suggestions on how the group might proceed, as well as discussing their current feelings. In this nature, while the player may know how they need to proceed, it is pivotal that the characters in the game are aware as well, as they will be unable to complete their tasks unless they have a logical reason to perform the action requested of them. This includes the ability to exchange items between characters that specifically suit the skill set required to use them. Though the game is fundamentally a point-and-click, the game does still have an element of linearity, not requiring the player to backtrack or obtain items for later use. Players are required to search each area for objects that can be used within that same environment to help solve problems and advance to the next area. The only items that are used throughout the entire adventure are the previously mentioned key items found near the beginning of the game. The game has also been compared to survival titles that preceded it, such as Dino Crisis, Parasite Eve, and Resident Evil, but it also seems to encompass some elements of stealth gameplay, requiring the player to sneak characters past enemies whilst they aren't looking. Each character has their own health bar, and if they are spotted by an enemy, they will be shot before returning to cover. The only way to recover health is by finding medical kits, though these are scarcely supplied. If any one character loses all of their health, it's game over, and the player must resume from their last save point. There are a number of variations on how a puzzle must be solved, some having to be completed with steps being taken in a specific order, sometimes under time constraints, and at other times, oddly, requiring the player to lose health in order to proceed. The only means of saving is by a prompt after every event in the narrative. As quite a notable feat for an original PlayStation title, the game has over 80 minutes of cinematic cutscenes. Despite the game being released exclusively in Japan, having a Japanese main character, and only containing Japanese text, the game's characters speak only in English and Spanish.
This should be the Government Army Communications Facility.
Tenemos órdenes de llevarla de vuelta. Los otros sobrevivientes deben ser exterminados.
IGN claimed that the game was made as a way for Sony to enter the Argentinian video game market, an area of the world that had been almost exclusively playing games on PC. GameSpot states that the game's release was timed with the advent of the PlayStation 2 launch, in order to boost sales of the PlayStation 1 in its stead. Aconcagwa's soundtrack stands out as a particularly strong element of the game's presentation, having been composed by the renowned musician Kazuhiko Toyama, famed for his work on productions such as Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, Wild Arms, and New Super Android Cutie Honey. While the country of Maruza is fictitious, a mountain by the name of Aconcagua is not. The real mountain is actually one of the highest mountains outside of Asia, being the highest in both southern and western hemispheres. Aconcagua is straight out of the gate with its unique nature, making its relative obscurity a mystery. The game follows a plot uncommon with console titles of the time, involving a logical and realistic political divide as the foundation for what would end up being an overall experience dealing with ideological differences, survival instincts, and group mentality. Because of the very harsh reality of these topics, there is little in the way of comedy or light-hearted drama. While there is, to a certain extent, typical action segments, the game makes a constant push to bring a more serious tone to the medium. Aconcagua is an early example of a slightly different push for the survival subgenre. Unlike its predecessors and more like Disaster Day of Crisis, much of the peril in the game's story revolving around real-world threats rather than typical supernatural horror antagonists. The game was set for a Western release sometime later the same year it was published in Japan, though ultimately this never came to fruition. A possible reason for this lack of localization may have been the close ties the game's plot had with these same real-world threats. The video game medium had little in the way of discussing real-world political issues before Aconcagua, and it may have been seen as a possible point of contention with the Western market. At the time, video games were largely still considered to be an escapist form of entertainment, often avoiding more realistic political discourse.